child's imagination is a beautiful thing. Vivid stories and images swirl throughout their minds, creating fantasy like no other. But what happens when those images are planted by the media? The following research aims to further understand depictions of mental illness in children's media and their impact on negative stigmas and attitudes in children. This topic is relevant due to the fact that stigmas against people suffering with mental illness are increasingly detrimental to their treatment and recovery processes. This study by Jürgen Menebo and Anne Van Acker draws heavily from the cultivation theory, which began with George Gerbner in the late 60s. Over several decades, he analyzed the differences between heavy and light television viewers, and he wanted to understand the relationship between exposure and perceptions of reality. He found that media's misrepresentations of the real world often prompted viewers to make assumptions that are not always based in fact. For example, those who watch medically inaccurate programs like Grey's Anatomy may be less likely to seek treatment at hospital for fear of negative consequences often portrayed on shows like these. It's also been observed that children have a harder time understanding the difference between fiction and reality. As previously stated, a lot of literature covers this topic. Dr. Otto Wall and other researchers sought to understand mental illness character portrayals in media, and they found overwhelming evidence in both television and newspapers that strong stereotypes do exist. Negative representations contradict actual data about the mentally ill, and those suffering from mental disorders are stigmatized. And the trait most often misrepresented is that mentally ill people are violent and unpredictable. Researchers focused on two possible factors that may be likely to impact a child's attitude toward mentally ill people. The first looks at the potential influence of overall exposure to television, and the second looks at the influence of specific television content. This study was conducted in Belgium and employed a sample method by issuing self-report questionnaires to 252 students who did not have prior knowledge of what the study was about. Participants' sex and educational levels were controlled. Overall exposure and specific content exposure were both measured using a Likert scale. Overall exposure was defined by how many hours a person spent watching television, and specific content was divided into two genres. Those were selected based on the abundance of storylines relating to mental illness. Researchers also looked at variables such as perceived realism, direct experience with someone who has a mental illness, perceived danger of those people, and judgments about a mentally ill person's ability to lead a normal life. Results were a bit mixed. On the one hand, research did find that some respondents stigmatized the mentally ill depending on a few variables. These participants might consider the mentally ill more dangerous if they watch more police or horror shows, if they've never had direct experience with someone suffering from mental disorder, and if they believe that TV portrays real life accurately. Overall, television exposure did not have a significant influence on kids' attitudes. However, specific types of exposure did have significance based on their nature and perceived realism of the show. The overall conclusion was that the amount of time viewing television and media is not as influential as the content itself. A person viewing 10 hours of an educational program about animals may not be subject to negative effects as much as a person who watched 1 hour of violent programming about mentally unstable characters. Researchers address a couple limitations to the study, the first being the homogeneous and fairly small sample size of high school students, and the second being that 2 of 4 control variables were dichotomous and had little variance as a consequence. These 2 variables were gender and direct experience with mentally ill people. Future research recommends a larger and demographically more representative sample, and the method could be improved with a more elaborate operationalization of direct experience.